It was 2022, and I can still feel the weight of that weekend in my heart as if it happened yesterday. Picture this, my dear friends. You have just spent a tender couple of days with your parents in the quiet town of Eureka, surrounded by the kind of love and familiar stories that fill your soul with warmth and gratitude. The drive home along Highway 101 on the Northern California coast is something you have done many times before, and during the daylight hours it feels like a gift from nature herself. The ocean sparkles like scattered diamonds, the tall trees stand proud and protective along the cliffs, and the fresh salt air carries a gentle promise of peace. But when night settles in, everything shifts in the most unsettling way. Those long, empty stretches of road stretch on forever with no other cars to keep you company. Your phone loses every bit of signal and leaves you completely cut off from the world, and the scattered lights are so faint they barely touch the darkness. It creates an ominous feeling deep in your chest, as if the night itself is holding its breath and watching you with unseen eyes. I remember hugging my parents goodbye that evening, their voices still echoing in my ears with words of love and careful driving. The visit had been so healing, filled with home-cooked meals that tasted like childhood and quiet talks that reminded me how much I cherished them. Yet I had an early shift waiting back in Oakland, and something in me wanted to push through and get home to my own bed. The cool evening air brushed against my face as I started the engine, carrying the soft scent of pine and distant sea, and for the first few miles I felt a quiet contentment. But the road ahead had other plans, plans that would turn a simple drive into one of the most haunting experiences of my life, the kind that leaves you lying awake at night wondering what was truly out there in the mist. If you're here for the first time, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join our community. You won't want to miss what happens next. I left my parents' loving home around 8 o'clock that Sunday evening, a choice that seemed practical in the moment, but one I would question with a heavy heart for years afterward. In hindsight, it would have been far kinder to myself to stay the night and begin the journey fresh the next morning when the light could guide me safely. But with an early shift waiting for me back home, I convinced myself that completing the long drive right then was the wiser path. Those kinds of thoughts are what we later call famous last words, aren't they? And they often carry a quiet regret. The first couple of hours passed without trouble, and I felt a gentle rhythm settle in as the road narrowed into the two-lane stretches so common once you leave the Bay Area behind. That is how most of rural Highway 101 feels up north, peaceful and open in a way that usually soothes the soul. It was somewhere around Trinidad when the fog began to roll in, and at first it seemed like nothing more than the usual coastal mist I had grown up knowing. Fog in that part of the world is no stranger, yet this felt entirely different from anything I had experienced before. Within just 5 minutes, the clear view I had enjoyed turned into something so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead of my headlights. It was truly worse than words can easily describe, heavy and damp in a way that pressed against the windshield like a living thing. I slowed my speed to around 35 miles an hour and kept moving forward, though the smart choice would have been to pull over and wait for it to lift. There simply were not many safe places to stop along that stretch, and honestly my heart was set on reaching home. Here is the strange truth about fog that thick that every California driver comes to know too well. It plays tricks on your sense of space and time. You lose sight of the familiar landmarks that usually help you measure distance. You cannot tell how far you have truly traveled, and the road ahead feels like it might vanish at any moment. It leaves you feeling deeply disoriented, especially when weariness from hours of driving has already begun to settle into your bones and your thoughts. After another half hour of careful driving, my headlights caught a figure standing off to the side of the road. At first it appeared only as a vague shape on the shoulder, perhaps 50 feet ahead, and my heart gave a small start. As I drew closer I could see it was a person, a man judging by his height, simply standing there facing the road without moving. He was not walking, not waving for help, and he did not seem to be on a phone. He was just there, perfectly still in the mist. I eased my speed even lower as I passed because I worried about accidentally brushing too close if he stepped forward. Yet he did not move at all, not even. Turning his head to follow my car with his eyes, and that stillness sent a quiet chill through me. I caught a clear glimpse of his face in the passing light, and nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary at first. My immediate thought was that perhaps his own car had broken down somewhere nearby and he was patiently waiting for assistance, which would have made perfect sense. Except I had not seen any vehicle pulled over earlier, and there was no clear reason for him to stand in that exact spot facing that exact direction with nothing but empty road around him. I considered turning around to ask if he needed help, but something in my chest whispered that the moment felt wrong in a way I could not name. It was not my place to get involved, so I kept driving forward with my hands a little tighter on the wheel. About 10 minutes later, though, my eyes caught the same figure again, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I'm not exaggerating even slightly. It was the same man, same build, same dark clothing, same motionless stance on the shoulder. The only difference was that this time he stood on the left side instead of the right, yet every other detail matched exactly. I actually spoke the words, "What on earth?" out loud to myself in the quiet car because it seemed impossible for him to have gotten ahead of me. I had been the only vehicle on that road, and there were no side streets or shortcuts he could have taken. The only possible explanation was that this was somehow a different person who happened to look identical and stand in the exact same eerie way. I tried not to look as I passed, but my eyes were drawn to him despite myself. I needed to be certain. After getting a good look, I knew without any doubt it was the same man. This time, however, he turned his head sharply and locked eyes with me, and the sudden movement made my stomach drop. I looked away as quickly as I could, but the memory of that stare lingered like cold fingers on my skin. I increased my speed just a little, not enough to lose control in the fog, but enough to put some distance between us, pushing toward 45 miles an hour while my heart beat faster. The fog grew even thicker after that, so heavy that I could scarcely see the center line, and I had no choice but to slow down once more. My thoughts felt scattered and heavy, a mix of exhaustion from the long drive, the strain of watching the road so carefully, and the unsettling encounter I had just left behind. I kept trying to find a reasonable explanation in my mind, yet none would settle. My train of thought broke suddenly because not 3 minutes later my headlights revealed another figure ahead. This time the man stood directly in the middle of the road, and I had no choice but to come to a complete stop, my brakes pressing gently under my foot. He wore a hood that covered his face, so I could not see his features clearly, yet something in my heart told me it was the same person. Once again he remained perfectly still, and that was the moment real fear began to rise inside me like a cold tide. We sat there in silence, my car idling and the fog swirling around us, and even without seeing his eyes, I could feel him looking straight at me. I did not know what to do next. I flashed my bright lights several times, hoping he would step aside or at least show some reaction, but he stayed exactly where he was. I shifted into reverse and glanced in my rearview mirror, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart completely. There was someone behind my car, moving slowly toward me through the mist. I cried out, "Oh my goodness," in pure shock and quickly shifted back into drive. I was trapped between them, yet fear for my safety gave me strength. I turned the wheel hard to the right, crossing into the opposite lane to go around the figure blocking the road. He did not move at all, and for a brief second I thought I had made it through safely. Then something struck the back of my car with sudden force. It was not a gentle bump, but a violent jolt that sent the entire rear end swinging to the right, accompanied by a terrible crunching sound of metal giving way. I kept control as best I could and continued driving forward, my mind racing with the thought that I had collided with another vehicle. Yet when I checked my mirrors again, there was nothing behind me, no car, no figures, only empty fog. As if the entire situation had not already been frightening enough, that emptiness made the fear sink even deeper into my bones. I did not wait around. I drove as quickly as the thick fog would safely allow, my hands trembling slightly on the wheel. By the time I reached the interchange where the highway widened, the mist finally began to lift and I could see clearly once more. For the first time in hours, my mind started to relax, the tension easing from my shoulders like a heavy coat being set aside, but the calmer I became, the more the events replayed in my thoughts. Surprisingly, I found myself concluding that I must have imagined the entire encounter. After nearly 4 hours of driving in exhaustion, staring into endless fog with no other souls around, a vivid hallucination did not seem so impossible. The odd details of it all still puzzled me, yet no other explanation felt reasonable for seeing those figures or feeling an impact that left no trace. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was ready to let sleep wash the whole night away and leave it behind. Yet when I walked around to the back of my car, my breath caught once more. The rear bumper was badly damaged, a deep dent running almost the full width of it from a blow far harder than I had realized in the moment. That meant the impact had been real, which meant I had not imagined everything after all. I stood there staring at the damage for several long minutes, my mind spinning. There was no paint transfer from another car, which would surely have been present in a collision, Yet if it had not been another vehicle, then I could not begin to understand what could have caused such harm. I did call the police later to report what I had seen, mostly to share the details in case anyone else had experienced something similar. I have thought about that night often over the past 4 years, turning every possible explanation over in my mind with care. What I have come to accept is that I likely imagined the figures in my tired state, and in my panic to escape, I must have struck a guardrail or a marker post along the road. The part that still troubles me deeply, however, is how I could have hallucinated one thing while truly experiencing the crash. The real damage to my car has always left me wondering if something more unsettling and perhaps even malicious was at work that night in the fog. This happened during my spring break just a few weeks ago. I am still in college and a senior now, and I made the trip back to my hometown for the week just as I always do. The trouble with returning home, though, is that there is truly very little to fill the days in a quiet suburban town like mine. It sits close enough to a larger city to feel connected, yet lacks any of the lively places that make evenings enjoyable, with no nearby spots for friends to gather or simple pleasures within walking distance. While I am at school, my schedule stays full and lively, but back home the streets feel almost empty and still. Another challenge is that none of my old friends from high school share the same break schedule as I do. I keep in touch with only 4 or 5 of them, and everyone was either still in classes or had already enjoyed their time off earlier in the month. So I faced a full week with nothing planned, and that thought did not bring me any happiness at all. I should also share that I have been trying to step away from a couple of habits lately, mainly nicotine and alcohol. I hoped a week at home with open time would either test my resolve or give me the quiet space to begin again with a clearer mind. I decided instead to focus on moving my body every single day. My plan was to lift weights each morning and go for runs in the afternoons, keeping myself busy so my thoughts would not drift into old patterns. That choice is what led me to head out for a run on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I remembered a familiar loop I used to run back when I competed in cross-country during high school. It measured exactly 3 miles from start to finish, beginning and ending right at my front door. The route carried me through my neighborhood for about a quarter mile before turning onto a peaceful wooded trail that wound gently through a small patch of forest, and then returned to the street just a block from home. I had followed that same path hundreds of times between my freshman and senior years. The section through the woods was always my favorite part. Running on hard pavement can be hard on the knees, but the trail there felt soft and forgiving beneath my feet. It was also wonderfully quiet, the kind of silence I have always sought during my runs to let my mind rest. So I set out around 5 in the afternoon. The sun still had a couple of hours before setting, so I felt perfectly safe with the daylight remaining. What caught my attention immediately, however, the very moment I stepped outside, was the fog. I do not know how else to describe it except to say it was thicker than any I had ever seen in my life. I had grown up in that town and thought I knew every kind of weather it could bring, yet this felt entirely new. It looked almost unreal, like the world beyond a certain distance simply melted away into soft gray haze. Everything past 30 or 40 feet disappeared into the mist. I considered skipping the run altogether, but I gently talked myself into going anyway. The trail through the woods is straight and simple, only one clear path with no forks or side trails to confuse anyone. I had traveled it so many times I believed I could have followed it with my eyes closed. I wore my Garmin watch to track my pace and distance, and I felt ready. I started my workout, covering the short distance through the neighborhood before stepping into the woods. The fog felt even denser among the trees, which made sense because the branches overhead blocked what little daylight remained. I could see no more than 15 or 20 feet ahead, but the path stayed easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything felt perfectly normal. I moved a little slower than usual because of the limited visibility, yet it felt manageable and even peaceful in its own way. I remember checking my watch around the 1 mile mark and again at a mile and a half, feeling steady and calm. The trouble began right around the 2.5 mile mark. At that point in the loop, I knew I should have been nearing the end of the trail. The path curves gently left, you climb a small hill, and then you step back onto pavement. I knew that section by heart after running it so many times. Yet when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles, I was still deep among the trees with no sign of the exit. I told myself the watch must be having a simple glitch. It was at least 4 years old, so perhaps the signal struggled under the thick tree cover or the heavy fog. Those seemed like reasonable explanations, so I kept running forward, believing I simply had not reached the end yet. But then I passed the 3-mile mark, and that was when a quiet worry began to grow inside me. 3 miles meant the full loop was complete. At that distance, I should have been standing in my driveway or on the street near home. Instead, the trees still surrounded me on both sides, and the same soft dirt path continued without any hint of an opening. So I stopped right there. I am not a person who panics easily or believes in things without clear reason. There had to be a simple explanation for what was happening. I caught my breath and tried to think clearly, yet no matter how I turned the facts over in my mind, I could not understand. There was only the one trail. I knew that without any doubt. There were no forks, no branches, no alternate paths at all. The only way I could have become lost would have been to leave the trail and push through the thick brush and undergrowth, yet I had stayed right on the path the entire time. I checked my watch again. It now showed 3.1 miles. The number kept climbing even though I stood completely still, which told me the GPS was definitely struggling. That was the one part that made any sense at all. I did not have many choices left. I could keep running forward and hope the exit would appear soon, or I could turn around and retrace my steps. Turning back felt like the safer decision. If I simply followed the path in reverse, I would eventually reach the beginning, and from there I knew exactly how to find my way home. So that is what I did. I turned around and began running back the way I had come. The fog had grown even thicker by then, though I did not think it possible for it to become any worse. I had to slow my pace carefully to make sure I stayed on the trail and did not wander off by mistake. After running about a mile in that direction, bringing my total distance to around 4 miles, I heard a sound that stopped me cold inside. As I said earlier, the woods are usually so quiet, likely because the area is too small to hold many animals. So any noise at all would have caught my attention. But this sound was something I had never heard before in my life. The closest I can come to describing it is a low moan, yet even that falls short. It was deeper, more like a steady drone that rose and fell in slow waves, almost like a human voice, yet not quite right. It would swell up, soften, then swell again in a way that felt completely wrong and unnatural. It did not sound like someone calling for help or even like someone in pain. It was simply a sustained, wavering noise that seemed to have no purpose at all. I started running faster, yet remember I had already covered more than 4 miles and my legs were growing heavy. I could only push so hard, and the tiredness only made the fear feel sharper and closer. Running harder tired me out even more quickly, and the more exhausted I became, the more frightened I felt. The sound did not stop or fade. No matter how fast I moved, whatever was making that noise seemed to match my pace exactly. Every time I glanced over my shoulder and I looked back several times, I saw only thick fog behind me. I kept running with that terrible sound following for what felt like an endless stretch of time. There was no other choice. It was the most frightening moment of my life. After what seemed like forever, I finally burst out of the woods and onto the street, so exhausted I nearly felt sick right there on the pavement. The fog remained impossibly thick even outside the trees. I turned around and looked back into the woods, and to my horror there was something standing right in the middle of the trail just a short distance inside. I call it something because no other word felt right. It was a dark shape, a tall silhouette in the mist. It was much taller than me, and since I stand 6 feet 1 inch, this figure had to be at least 7 feet high. It was not moving closer or farther away. It simply stood there watching me. I could feel its presence like a weight on my skin. If it had not been gently swaying from side to side, I might have wondered if I was looking at nothing more than a tree. The strange, droning sound had stopped, yet I was not about to wait for it to begin again. I turned and ran straight home without looking back even once. That was only a few weeks ago now. I am back at school, yet I have not been able to set the memory aside. I cannot stop seeing that dark shape in the fog or hearing that awful sound in my quiet moments. I told my parents about what I had seen, of course, and they both felt certain it must have been a tall person trying to frighten me, or perhaps worse. I suppose that is possible, yet something in my heart tells me it was not that simple. How could anyone make that strange noise while keeping pace with me through the woods? And the height was far beyond any ordinary person. I do not know what waited in those woods that afternoon, and I may never know. This happened about 6 years ago in late September. My good friend Edwin and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for nearly 2 years, and we finally set aside a weekend to make the trip happen. If you have never visited the area, Willapa Bay is a vast tidal estuary along the Washington coast, stretching about 25 miles long. It is mostly oyster farms and protected wildlife areas, and on a clear day it feels like one of the most peaceful places on Earth. The weekend we chose was not clear at all. Neither of us was new to the water. We had both been kayaking since we were young, and Edwin had even worked as a guide for several summers during college. We knew exactly what we were doing, and that matters because I want you to understand we were not simply two careless people who got startled by whether we did not understand. We launched early Saturday morning from a spot near Nacelle. The fog was quite thick, yet we believed it would burn off by mid-morning the way coastal mist often does. We carried a GPS, a compass, and everything we needed for safety. Our plan was to paddle out toward Long Island, enjoy some quiet bird watching, have a simple lunch on one of the sandbars, and return before the afternoon tide changed. The first hour or so went smoothly. The fog wrapped everything in a soft, quiet blanket the way coastal mist does, making the world feel gentle and far away. You feel as though you are moving through cotton, and every sound becomes hushed and distant. We could see no more than perhaps 40 feet in any direction, but we stayed close together and checked our direction every few minutes. It felt like no big trouble at all. It was probably around 9 o'clock when I first noticed the sound. There was a soft splashing, and at first I thought it came from Edwin. He paddled about 15 feet to my left in loose formation, and I assumed he had simply adjusted his stroke. But when I looked over, his paddle rested quietly across his kayak. He asked if I had heard it too, and I nodded. We both stopped paddling and let our kayaks drift for a moment, listening carefully. The sound was clearly oars, not paddles, and I noticed the difference because oars and paddles make very distinct noises. We were using paddles. Oars belonged to a different kind of boat, yet there was no doubt someone was rowing nearby, perhaps 100 feet off to our right. Edwin suggested it was probably just another person out on the water, and that seemed reasonable enough. Other kayakers used the bay, and sometimes small fishing boats checked crab pots. Fog was thick enough to hide them, and sound travels in strange ways over water, especially in mist. Things can seem closer or farther than they truly are. We waited a minute, expecting whoever it was to call out or appear through the haze. When visibility is low, the polite thing is to let others know you are there. Yet the rowing continued at the same steady rhythm without any change. I wondered aloud if they simply had not noticed us. Edwin called out a friendly hello into the mist, but there was no reply. In fact, the rowing did not speed up, slow down, or shift at all, as if the person had not heard us. We began paddling, again thinking we would either meet them soon or they would pass by. Yet over the next 20 minutes that same rowing sound never grew closer or farther away. Hearing the exact same rhythm repeat over and over began to feel almost hypnotic. After a while, I found myself quietly amazed at how steadily someone could keep that pace. But as more time passed, the feeling inside me turned from curiosity to something much more uneasy. Edwin and I spoke less and less, yet I could tell he felt the same growing discomfort. At one point, we shifted our course slightly toward the east, hoping to angle closer to shore, and for just a second the fog thinned enough for me to see a small rowboat sitting on the water. I could make out the shape of someone at the oars, so I knew a person was there, but then the mist closed again and they vanished. The glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he had seen it too, and he said yes. At that moment, I wanted to head for land. Something about the whole situation sat heavily in my chest, though I could not fully explain why. We had not seen anything threatening, only a person rowing a boat, yet the way they refused to answer or even acknowledge us, and the way the sound seemed to stay with us felt deeply unsettling. I started paddling toward shore, hoping Edwin would follow, and he did. The trouble was the fog. Even with our GPS, finding our way across the bay in such low visibility is never simple. Sandbars shift with the tides, shallow channels can trap you, and many hidden dangers wait beneath the surface. We knew roughly where we were, but roughly is not the same as certainty. The last thing we wanted was to run aground on a mud flat while that other boat remained somewhere nearby. We paddled southeast as quickly as we could without tiring ourselves too much. The rowing sound stayed with us the entire time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping for another glimpse, yet I saw nothing. Then without any warning, the fog began to lift. It did not disappear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see perhaps 100 yards in every direction. I immediately looked to my right where the rowing had been coming from. There was nothing there, only open water. I looked behind us and in every other direction, and Edwin did the same. As far as we could tell, the bay was completely empty. I turned to Edwin and saw that his fear ran even deeper than my own. I could read it clearly in his eyes. We kept paddling, and even though the rowing sound had stopped and we could see again, the feeling inside us had grown much heavier. How could an entire boat simply vanish like that? The shore appeared about 5 minutes later, and relief washed through me. I thought the strange morning was finally behind us, but it was not. We paddled straight for land without searching for the best spot. We reached the shallows, and I stepped out into knee-deep water. The water felt icy cold, yet I hardly noticed because I was simply grateful to feel solid ground beneath me. For a minute or two, neither of us spoke. We stood there on the beach catching our breath and looking out across the bay. The fog continued to lift slowly, which was a comfort, yet no boats appeared anywhere on the water. Edwin had walked a short distance up the beach while I secured my kayak. He called me over quietly, so I followed. I realized he was studying something on the sand, and when I caught up, the sight sent fresh fear through me. There were footprints, wet and barefoot, leading out of the water and up onto the beach. They looked fresh because water still pooled gently in the impressions. Whoever had made them had left the water only moments earlier. Yet here is what made my skin prickle. The prints did not simply stop on the beach. They came out of the water, walked a few feet toward the tree line, then turned and followed the shoreline to our left before finally cutting back toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I traced the path with my eyes, trying to follow it backward. The prints seemed to come from farther down the beach. Whoever made them had walked along the water's edge, stepped onto the sand right where we had landed, and then headed into the forest. Edwin stood a few steps ahead of me. He said he wanted to leave right away, but I could not stop looking at those prints. They seemed to lead somewhere, or rather they came from somewhere, and a quiet need to understand tugged at me. I told Edwin I wanted to follow them back along the shore, not into the trees, but in the other direction, just to see where they began. He looked at me as if I had lost my senses, and perhaps I had, yet the whole morning had been pressing on my thoughts since we first heard those oars, and I was not ready to paddle away without at least trying to make sense of it. Edwin did not want to go with me, yet he also did not want stand alone on the beach. After a short back and forth, he agreed reluctantly. We began following the footprints down the shoreline. The fog had not fully cleared, but the visibility had improved enough to see clearly. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes with the prints on our left, and then I saw it. About 50 yards farther down the beach, a small wooden rowboat sat pulled up on the sand at an angle. The wood looked dark, almost black, and the oars rested neatly inside. It was the same boat. I felt certain of it in my bones. The shape, the color, the size, everything matched the brief glimpse I had caught through the fog earlier. And now it rested here on the shore with a trail of wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it without thinking, but Edwin caught my arm firmly. He told me we were leaving immediately and that he was not asking this time. He said he did not care what was in the boat or who had been rowing it. We were finished. Something in the tone of his voice shifted me from curiosity to outright fear in an instant. Whoever had been in that boat had somehow reached the shore before us in a much slower vessel, walked all the way down the beach to the exact spot where we happened to land, and still had time to vanish into the trees. We turned around and hurried back toward our kayaks. Edwin was practically running by then, and seeing his fear only deepened my own. We reached our kayaks, pushed them quickly into the water, and paddled away from that shore as fast as our arms would carry us. And that was the end of it. I have thought about that morning many times over the past 6 years. I have turned every possible explanation over in my mind with care and patience. The gentlest possibility is that we were simply the targets of an elaborate prank, yet even that feels far-fetched when I consider all the details. What I keep returning to is this: we had been on the water for more than 2 hours. We paddled in several different directions, changed course more than once, and finally headed straight for shore when the fog began to lift. Whoever was in that rowboat would have needed to reach land ahead of us in a slower vessel, walk the entire length of the shoreline to the exact place we landed, and still disappear into the trees before we even stepped onto the sand. It sounds so impossible and absurd that I honestly do not know what to believe. So after sharing this story with you today, I am going to try once more not to think about it at all. What do you think was really waiting out there in the fog on those nights? Write your guesses in the comments, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss any new stories.